I'm going to turn it over to Kate Hennessy to speak now. So Kate is an associate professor specializing in media at Simon Fraser University's School of Interactive Arts and Technology. As an anthropologist of media and director of the Making Culture Lab, an interdisciplinary research creation and production studio, her work uses collaborative feminist decolonial methodologies to explore the impacts of new memory infrastructures and cultural practices of media, museums, and archives in the context of technoscience. She's a founding member of the ethnographic Terminalia Collective, which I may have got wrong there, but
Thanks so much, Richard. Can you hear me? Okay. And are we going to share my slides from the main computer? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay, hello. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share this work and these ideas as a part of Crossing Fonts. I'm learning a lot. My name's Kate Hennessy. I just want to begin by introducing myself as a person of Irish, German, and American descent. I was raised on Galliano Island here in British Columbia. My parents moved there around the time of the Vietnam War. Galliano Island is in the unceded territory of the Penelakut and Lamalchi and Whalitsim peoples, as well as the shared asserted unceded traditional territories of other Halkamenim-speaking peoples and the ceded traditional territories of the Tsawwassen First Nation. And I now live and work here on the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Really happy to be a part of this panel. I was just listening to Lauren's presentation, and I'm just reflecting on the importance of the archive and memory in standing against anti-Semitism. But I also, before I begin, I want to express my solidarity with the people of Palestine and the cause of Palestinian liberation, which is aligned with calls for justice and equality and decolonization in many parts of the world, including here in British Columbia. And I'm also thinking this morning about my colleagues and their students who at this very minute are across the United States trying to exercise their right to peaceful protest. And that's something that's sitting very heavily with me today as I share this work, which is fundamentally about decolonization and the work that we can do together in solidarity. So my presentation is titled Digital Collections and Research Creation, Collaborative Media Production as a Method for Decolonial Curation. And through the lens of some of the projects that I've had the privilege of working on as a producer, a designer, and a researcher, I'll show how the act of collaborative design and co-creation through what is increasingly being referred to here in Canada as research creation opens up a generative space for the articulation of cultural property rights and ongoing relationships to land and family, which challenge dominant colonial paradigms of ownership and relations of power. So this is an approach that I've been working on with colleagues and graduate students and community partners and artists through the development of the Making Culture Lab, which is an interdisciplinary research group here and studio, right just upstairs at the School of Interactive Arts and Technology. And this is a space that I share with Professor Gabriela Aceves-Sepulveda's Critical Media Arts Studio. In the making of these projects that I'll talk about and some of the other ones that you might be interested in looking at on our website, we prioritize engagement with issues of digital circulation, ownership, collaboration, and how these issues can be expressed through the work. These are some of those projects on the site right now. And in talking about a couple of these projects today, I'll be drawing on three main themes. First, the concept of belongings, which is a term increasingly being used in British Columbia institutions in place of the word artifact or object. Also, the dynamic of return, which can include digital access and replication, but more fundamentally refers to the ongoing struggle for repatriation of Indigenous ancestors and cultural property from museums. So return is central to the two projects I'll describe and the decolonial work that we're challenged to undertake. And then the third is research creation as a collaborative methodology that values artwork, performance, exhibition, curation, and other non-text focused outcomes as knowledge contributions. So the first project I'm going to talk about is a virtual exhibit funded by the Virtual Museum of Canada that was created in collaboration with the Stolo and the Scowlitz Nations in British Columbia and a very, very long list of partners. It's called Scowlitz, a Stolo Coast Salish community in the Fraser River Valley. And in this project, the reconnection, remediation, and recontextualization of fragmented collections was central to our curatorial and design process. And then the second project is a more recent project on and around my home community of Galiano Island. It's called The Water We Call Home, and it's co-curated by myself and Rosemary Georgeson and Jessica Hallenbeck, in which reconnecting family members by tracing family in the archive and identifying absences in the archive, and then represencing ancestral territory drove our production and our curatorial process. So these two projects help to illustrate how research creation and collaborative methodologies can create opportunities to engage with the complexities of digitally circulating and producing expressions of Indigenous cultural knowledge while offering up possibilities for decolonial interventions in settler colonial art and memory institutions. As some background to these projects, I think many in the room are very aware contemporary claims for repatriation of cultural property and the settler, colonial, and post-colonial historical context are inextricably intertwined. For those who work in and with museums, this is obvious, and for those whose belongings and ancestors remain in museums, this is ever present, but it's also increasingly part of broader public conversation advocating for the return of belongings to their source communities as a part of an effort to decolonize museum practice. However, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang point out in their influential article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, the easy adoption of the language of decolonization by settler scholars in these contexts ignores the fact that decolonization wants something different from other forms of justice. From their perspective, decolonization in the settler colonial context must involve the repatriation of land, simultaneous to the recognition of how land and relations to land have always been differently understood and enacted. So decolonizing the museum in settler colonial British Columbia fundamentally involves the repatriation of ancestral remains as an acknowledgement of the ways in which belongings have continuously been in relationship with their source communities, and that those relationships are differently understood and enacted by originating communities. As we wrote in a reference to an interactive tabletop that we developed a few years ago with Musqueam curator Jordan Wilson and curator Sue Rowley for the 2015 exhibition at the Museum of Anthropology, Cessnam, the City Before the City, our Musqueam collaborators understand these items to have been created by and continue to belong to their ancestors. For this reason, we refer to them as elek, a Hunkaminam term meaning belongings. By reframing Musqueam's material culture using this term, we emphasize the continuity of intangible forms of knowledge that are intrinsically connected to belongings. The belongings from Cessnam connect contemporary Musqueam people to their ancestors and their shwayal, their teachings received since childhood. So in the two projects that I'll just touch down on, I hope if you're interested in them, you might want to visit the website because they're very content rich and very deep, but I'm just going to kind of point to them in my talk. I just want to emphasize that belonging, and documenting ongoing relations to land are central themes that drive our research creation process as a method for doing decolonial curation. So Scowlitz, which you can see at digitalscowlitz.ca, this project actually started about 30 years ago when the band leadership of the Scowlitz Nation reached out to archaeologists at UBC and SFU because a burial ground was going to be logged and they needed evidence that it was indeed a burial ground. So archaeologists have been working for more than 20 years with the Scowlitz Nation doing summer field schools to learn about and to drive collaborative community-based archaeology, and having that led by Scowlitz spiritual leaders to engage with history, archaeology, and ancestors, it turns out, in a good way. In the course of this work, they uncovered thousands of belongings. They uncovered huge amounts of evidence of past lifeways, like dependence and on salmon in the Fraser River. And of course, they also encountered ancestors, and those were a few of them looked at and then reburied according to Scarlett's protocol. So years later, there was a great interest in reconnecting fragmented archaeological collections that were in many different institutional repositories, and finding a way to reconnect them to people, to tell the story of collaborative community-based archaeology at Skowlitz, but also how this could influence the design of media for aimed really at Skowlitz youth looking into the future. So this is a collaborative process led by Stolo Research and Resource Management Center and Skowlitz Nation. It was very important, based on what they had worked on together through archaeology, to think about cultural and linguistic principles that would guide the website development, led by elders and the band, to somehow bring together these fragmented collections. These are just some of the sort of ideas shared in some meetings early on, thinking about Hunkaminam and Skowlitz principles for different kinds of knowledge. We used a system that some may be familiar with, the Reciprocal Research Network at UBC, which we used to document and digitize thousands of archaeological belongings, which could then be brought together through one portal, and then based on that curated a series of sort of representative exhibits in the website. We also undertook a great deal of oral history documentation and video production in the community to connect those belongings to story and to people. That involved traveling out to places throughout Skowlitz territory, reconnecting with community leaders who had knowledge, Shwohuyam knowledge to share, and then importantly, going through a number of workshops with the community to look at the products of our documentation, the video, the photography, and to think about what was appropriate to share with the public. So if you visit the site, you'll see actually up in the top corner, you see some little icons, which are traditional knowledge labels. This was a project and a workshop we did with Kimberly Christian and Jane Anderson from the Local Context Project. I saw someone's working with the Mukuru archive, and so these are the creators of that archive, to basically think about Skowlitz approach to identifying and naming particular kinds of knowledge that they're choosing to express through the website. The site, I'm going to try to be really quick. The site is organized according to cultural principles. So Shwohuyam, this would be the stories of the past, the deep past, origin stories. Shkwelkwel are the personal stories, and more recent oral histories. And this is how the site is developed. And if you look through the site, you'll see particular Skowlitz identifications of these traditional knowledge labels, kind of like Creative Commons licenses, except they aim to recognize the particularities of traditional knowledge. Things like attribution, non-commercial, secret, sacred, things that should not be shown, but still want to be acknowledged, and this idea of verification as well. So throughout the site, of course, human remains would never be shown, but it was important to the community to be clear that where this project started was the identification of ancestors on their territory. And during the project, there was also a significant repatriation of ancestors from the Museum of Vancouver, which was important to include as a part of the project. And then just as a final outcome, this virtual project was translated into a number of physical exhibitions on Stolo territory. So this was an exhibition at the Reach Gallery Museum in Abbotsford that features all the films, photography, and labels. The Chilliwack Museum and Archives, and then at the end of that, all of this work was brought back to the Skowlitz Band Hall, where it still is. So that project, was a starting point, was bringing together records, digital records, creating digital records based on archaeological belongings. This project, which I'll just introduce very briefly, really started with going to the archive, looking for information about family members and not seeing it there, and then undertaking a massive project of repair and reconnection. So this is a project led by Rosemary Georgeson. She's a Coast Salish Satu Dene woman from Galliano Island, where I grew up, and Jessica Hallenbeck, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Queen's University right now. Here's a picture from Vivo in 2015, where Rose and Jess presented this project. Essentially, Rosemary asked Jessica to help her find her maternal grandmothers who had been written out of the archive. And as a member of a family who was never recognized by the federal government in terms of their status and having lost their status, it was very hard for Rosemary to reconnect with her family. But this has opened up a really important and exciting project. Its most recent manifestation, going back about 3 years, is called The Water We Call Home. And the goal here was to re-presence Indigenous women's connections to fish, water, and family around the Salish Sea. It involved an advisory circle of women who are related to each other familially, but also through fishing and through water. Rose, of course, Faye Blaney, Christy Lee Charles, Karen Charlie, who sadly has left us, Eva Wilson, and Kimmy Haxton. So this project, bringing people together, and back to the theme of participatory production, was a series of gatherings where people, the advisory circle, extended friends, family, settler witnesses came together to film and witness people's stories of their family connections. This took place in a number of different sites on Galliano Island. Over multiple days for people to come up with ways of connecting that we wanted to document for a series of exhibitions that would be ahead. So sometimes it was going through photo archives and thinking of ways to acknowledge and represent these images, like we did here at Bluff Park on Galliano Island, or the suggestion by Karen that we should enact a traditional clam baking ceremony to teach youth how to do this work, and then invited Keely Spitzer, Dene Jewish photographer, to document this work. And all of this was shown a couple of summers ago at the Yellow House Art Center on Galliano Island, with a community process leading up to the installation and the opening of the exhibition, where family members from 7 nations came together to be a part of the event. You can see the little exhibition here. Which included, I think, 5 films, many photographs, and some audio experiences. And then the exhibit is now at the Gulf of Georgia Cannery in Steveston, British Columbia, for the next couple of years, which has been an opportunity to reconnect it to some important archives here, to talk about the history of women in the fishing industry and the exclusion of Indigenous people from the fishing industry and their resistance to that. So to close, scholars Corey Snellgrove, Rita Damoon, and Jeff Corntassel call for a contextual approach to questions of settler colonialism, settlers, and solidarity. They argue that this requires accountability to one another. This requires what they term place-based solidarities, ultimately relationships and practices that, quote, center both Indigenous resurgences and more relational approaches to settler colonial power. In my talk, I've given examples of research creation as a collaborative media production and remediation that have been built on and aim to continue to do the work of developing long-term relationships between settler heritage institutions, such as universities, galleries, and museums, and Indigenous and community partners. In these examples, ongoing relations to territory and family are shared. The return of ancestors and digital reconnection of fragmented collections, and the reconnection of families with my families and knowledge to the land are yeah, I just heard that. And I just have one sentence to say. I'll yell it. Okay. The return of ancestors and belongings, the digital reconnection of fragmented collections, and the reconnection of families and knowledge to the land are significant outcomes. I hope I've shown how collaborative media production has been central in our processes of decolonial, curatorial, and design practices. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. So I'm not sure what's going on with this.
Let's just wipe out the audience.
Okay,
mic
sure. Yep.
For now. Yeah, I'll deal with this one.
Thanks. Is it working? Okay, great. Okay, our next speaker is Joey Takeda. Joey is a developer in the Digital Humanities Innovation Lab at Simon Fraser University Library, specializing in text encoding, digital editions, digital project preservation and sustainability, minimal computing, and digital exhibits. He currently sits on the Text Encoding Initiative Technical Council, the TEI by Example International Advisory Committee, and the Public Knowledge Project Technical Advisory Committee. He holds an MA in English Literature from the University of British Columbia and is currently an MLIS student at the University of Alberta. His writing and work can be found in the Digital Humanities Quarterly, Digital Studies, Le Champ Numérique, and Legacy, a Journal of American Women Writers. So over you, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, and I just want to give a thanks to Crossing Fonds team for all the sort of gathering work that the team has been doing of archives of people, community that they've been engaged in over the last couple of years. So my original intent today, entitling the talk Between Modularity and Minimalism, was going to discuss some of these aesthetic paradigms that sort of reign within DH sort of project creation and digital infrastructure. And I do want to still talk about minimal computing in a sense, but I was also really inspired last night after seeing Sarah Karen Amia's talk at Vivo about Case Study 1 and feminist labor organizing in BC. And I was struck in that discussion about that convergence of labor that we see in the archive. So not just in the histories of labor and union organizing, but in the sort of meta histories that laminate these archives, the stories of Sarah and Karen's collaborations, oral histories, and the ecosystem that precede the digital one that they've been building over the last year. So I was struck, in other words, by the sustained attention and sustained collaboration and the sustained care and repair that is enacted in a project like Crossing Fonds. So for today, I want to join in a bit by thinking a bit more about the relationship between infrastructure and sustainability and the personal case study. What it feels like to be laboring at that junction, at the junction of archival histories and at the crossroads of fonds. To think through the creation of DH projects generally, where sustainability and acts of maintenance and acts of care and repair are in many ways technologies of sharing, both in the present and the future. Oh, sure, of course. As you heard, I currently work as a developer at Simon Fraser University's Digital Humanities Innovation Lab, which is a small unit housed within the university library, which started up around 2017, and that supports a wide range of DH projects that vary in size and scope. And a lot of our challenges in the lab and across DH kind of writ large is that question of sustainability, the sustainability of digital resources that we create and of the infrastructure that we hope to maintain. And so I want to think a bit more about the term sustainability, which is, of course, a term with a really weighty history, charged with all sorts of technical, ecological, infrastructural, architectural, and economic meaning, which I can't really do justice here fully. But I do want to think about what it offers those engaged in the work of not only fortifying digital humanities projects, but also rallying against the perceived fragility, to use Matthew Kirschenbaum's phrase, of the digital and consequently of the digital humanities. So I'm inspired here and as well as elsewhere, as you'll hear in a bit, by Amy Earhart's Traces of the Old, Uses of the New, which traces the sort of early history of digital humanities projects, and in particular, digital recovery literary scholarship. And in Earhart's discussion of the demise of many early digital recovery projects, she notes that digital humanists are fond of talking about sustainability as a problem for current and future works, but it's clear that we already have sustained a good deal of loss within the broadly defined DH canon. And what I want to think about here is not necessarily what she's saying, but how she's saying it, and the way that she's using sustainability and the sort of double-edged effective sense of the word to sustain. So at once, to sustain represents these custodial acts of caring for, which is the first definition in the OED, to support, maintain, uphold. But in her discussion of sustainability, she says that we sustain a good deal of loss. Sort of talking about the second sense of to sustain, which refers to sort of inflicted damage, a sort of nagging burden that erodes and indeed can create rather than mitigate breakdown. So in many ways, this is what the upkeep of a project means within an institution, or can mean: sustaining a project, to keep it going, to maintain it, even though the technical stack is crumbling and developers are tasked with grafting hacks upon hacks to keep it running. It's frequently injurious to the broader institutional body. So it sustains a project like it sustains an injury. So I want to think a bit about my own, a few case studies in which we can kind of see the multiple meanings of sustainability. And speaking sort of from my location as a sort of developer, somebody who's working and collaborating within these projects. And the first one I want to talk about, I'm calling it case study 0, because it's sort of the groundwork for what I want to talk about today, is the Endings project. The Endings project was a project out of the University of Victoria, which aimed to create a set of principles that outlined how a project could be built, either retrospectively or from the outset, in ways that would ensure maximal archivability and durability. It was a collaborative research initiative from UVic, and had a number of faculty, PIs, so people who had projects, who had existing projects within the lab, the Humanities Computing and Media Center, librarians, and developers who worked in the Humanities Computing Media Center. And they were all, at this point, these were long-lasting projects, or projects that have been around for at least a decade. And the lab itself was starting to feel the sort of burden of these projects that they had to continue to maintain. And it was starting to challenge their capacity to actually bring on new projects. So these projects were the Robert Graves Diary project, Map of Early Modern London, Le Mariage, and the Nahakameen Database and Dictionary. All these projects with various long lifespans, all of which have been kind of written about separately as well, and I encourage you to kind of take a look at some of these projects. And the goal with the Endings project was to take these existing websites and recreate them in such a way in which they could be sustainable, they could be preserved. And the website should look and function exactly as they did before. They should be completely portable and amenable to archiving. And the websites themselves should be coherent, consistent, and complete, meaning that we know that everything that's supposed to be on that website is there, that everything inside of the website links to itself, there are no broken images, there's no broken functionality. And we were able to do that after a number of sort of years of really working with these projects and rebuilding them through developing them all into static websites. Static websites are really popular within the development world, or gaining popularity, often known as like the Jamstack. And it's also often allied with minimal computing. But unlike minimal computing or Jamstack, Endings was initially focused on how to construct websites, was not initially focused on how to construct websites from the beginning, but it was about converting these long-running projects into something that could, at any point, be archived. And we tried a bunch of other things with the Wayback Machine. The Wayback Machine didn't work very well. It seemed to sort of, if you ever had like a query string on the end of a project URL, wouldn't archive that properly. The indexer wouldn't be able to find all the pages that you wanted it to find. There are better ways now of doing that kind of stuff in Internet Archive or the Wayback Machine, but they are still very labor intensive and a lot of sort of human going through and basically replaying the entire website. So we found that the Wayback Machine was imperfect for what we wanted to do, and that static websites, on the other hand, lend themselves to crawling. They're just simple pages that can be added to the Internet Archive. And other solutions are thinking about what about splitting out, taking the data and putting that into a repository. But we know that there's value in preserving the entire part of a website, that the website itself is not just the data, not just the code, but it's sort of everything, the whole performance of that digital resource. And with minimal computing or with static websites, you don't have any of the on-the-fly server-side processing that might mitigate or stop crawlers from finding the pages. And static websites themselves are only made of HTML and CSS. And in the endings project's sort of view of static websites, also do not contain critical JavaScript. So they run completely without JavaScript as well. Maybe not as nicely, but they should still work. And the reason we did this was because there's no server-side interaction, so they're less vulnerable. So you don't have to worry about security updates. You don't have to worry about things going out of date or the systems administration saying this old website is now too much of a risk. We should get rid of it. HTML, JavaScript, and CSS are all standards, so they're very unlikely to go away. Everything has to be able to run HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so we feel pretty confident that they'll persist. And they can be portable, so they can run on any server. So I can have a static website on my computer, somebody can have it on their server, libraries could have them replicated and accessioned and cataloged, or they could be on the Wayback Machine, and they don't take up much space or resource. So classic example of that, the first website ever created, which promises to have everything about the World Wide Web on it, is still around, still exists, works perfectly, and because this is just a static page of HTML, CSS, JavaScript. An even more important cultural document, the Space Jam website, also static website, and also still works, amazingly since from 1996. And also very much encourage people to look at the Space Jam website. It's a really interesting piece of media history. I spent far too long down a rabbit hole looking at the Space Jam website. So through that work, we devised a set of principles, which I'm going to go through very, very quickly, just sort of the headings. There's many, many sub-principles, and I encourage you to look at the endings website to look at the principles. But we split what it means to make a preservable website into kind of 5 components. So there's the data, the source data, and that's sort of aligning with the FAIR principles of findable and reusable. Documentation being a crucial part of any website, and documentation also meaning things like licensing and permissions and responsibilities. And that's all kinds of documentation, not just technical ones, but the really sort of, banal, everyday kind of bits of documentation of how do you log on to stuff, who has the keys to this, et cetera. Processing, meaning all of the code that goes into building that website. For the endings principles, we think that processing is okay to be ephemeral. We don't know if the processing is always going to work, but that's okay because the products are supposed to be the thing that stick around forever. So the processing in a static site is split off from the actual products that you get at the end, and the products should be coherent, consistent, complete. And then our final thing is release management, which for endings means that rather than having a rolling release cycle, rather than having rolling releases where you update one page and you only update one page and the whole website kind of shifts accordingly, right? You change somebody's bio and it should sort of populate everywhere. What should happen for a static site is that you change one little thing and the whole website rebuilds. You have a whole new version, like a new edition of a book. And so we have a set of principles that go along with this as well about what it means to be compliant with endings. And I'm just going to kind of skip through these. But these primarily are just sort of the guidelines that ending thinks about in terms of whether or not something can be thought about as being kind of ending compliant. And one thing I will mention here is that with endings, citation and date information is very important because we want to know what version of the site it is. It's like the colophon of a book. It also helps sort of increase the scholarly sort of legitimacy of this website. You have a citation information, people know how to cite it very easily. It's not a question of whether they should or can cite it. It's right there. But I want to as part of the as part of Project Endings, there was a special issue of DHQ that came out post a symposium, and in this special issue, Claire Battershill has an excellent essay about the sort of effective sense of doing project work, of what it means to do project work. And in that essay, she says, there's value in thinking about the stories and relationships we're making along the website's digital archives, databases, tools, marked up text, maps, and other digital artifacts that arise from large-scale collaboration in the field. And she encourages us to think beyond institutional repositories and mirror sites to consider the lived experience of project making and the structure of the story that we're telling about this work. So while endings and staticization sound as if there's sort of like deadening or kind of ossifying of projects into these inert products, I would suggest that they're kind of more lively activities, sort of acts of care, repair, or of tending, to borrow from Keel Moe and Daniel Friedman's recent discussion of architectural maintenance. And they say that tending points to an understanding of repair that's neither episodic nor incidental, and towards a capacious practice that takes a longer, largely non-teleological view of repair-related acts. So recalibrating our sense of labor from maintenance burden or dependency hell to tending allows us to think about the energizing capacities of sustainability when made central to the research. So that there is interesting work that goes into the process of creating these sort of static products, and they offer the challenge of thinking minimally and also expansively, of working ways that kind of move beyond pure maintenance. And I will very briefly give a very quick case study of the Winifred Eaton Archive, and shout out to Sydney Lines, if she's still here, for all the work. This comes a lot from the work she and I have done on the Winifred Eaton Archive. This is a archive that we've created about Winifred Eaton, an early Asian Canadian, Asian American novelist. And it's one of the projects, the original one, the Winifred Eaton Digital Archive, is one of the projects that Amy Earhart cites as sort of part of this digital degradation, as emblematic of this sort of failure of literary projects at the very beginning to be sustained. It used to be hosted by the University of Virginia, then it got put into the institutional repository, and then it got split out for all its paratextual materials, and now it's sort of imperfectly archived. The original one is imperfectly archived, hard to get all of the texts that were recovered by this writer. And the original editor of that site called it a ghost in the Wayback Machine. But part of what we did when we created the new Winifred Eaton Archive, which is a static site that was sort of added on to the Endings project, is thinking about this work of sort of re-recovering these projects as a sort of act of collaborative and interesting work to sort of do these acts of repair and maintenance. So taking the degradation of this digital project as a central and interesting problem with which to work with, rather than at best a sign of impending doom, or at worst a justification not to do the work at all. So the last thing I'll say very kind of briefly, so not to hold us up for lunch, is, this is from the Internet Archive, the original one, and it not working on the Wayback Machine. Last thing I'll say here, that there's a third sense of sustained that I want to kind of leave you with, and the idea of being sustained by a project. So the sort of the personal fulfillment, the kind of labor and work that goes into working on a project, is kind of the third resonance of sustaining. When I worked on the Landscapes of Injustice project, which is a large archive of Japanese Canadian materials. When one works on projects, you usually have a favorite document they look at all the time just to test stuff out. Mine with Protest Letter 001, which I discovered had my great-grandfather's name in it, who was part of the South Fraser Farmers Union, writing against the custodian after the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. And in doing so, I found all sorts of documents about him. I was not a part of the project as part of the research. I was doing the sort of digital archival parts, but you can see the sort of entanglement of the sort of research and digital sort of nature of this work. More just sort of documents of things found in these large sort of case files. And in doing so, it led me to find more archives about him, including from the township of Langley, where this is a picture of where they lived in Coughlin, which I think is current day Burnaby-ish, around there, and a photo from that archive in Langley. So as Janet Abbott and Stephanie Dick say, to think with computers is to think about social relations. And so in thinking about sustainability, I want to kind of encourage thinking about all of these different relationships that are being sustained. So to ask questions like who uses it, who builds it, who maintains it, who archives it, who benefits, who doesn't, and then who sustains it as an injury, and who is sustained by it. Thanks.